Hello, I'm Mischievous, and this is SedIT. Today we're going to be continuing our modeling tutorial and exercises by creating some simple furniture for our map. As you can see, since last time I did some improvements. I added a new corridor where I'm going to add a door. Made normal maps for the textures, and also added a wood material so that now it sounds as if I'm actually walking on a wooden floor. I'm not sure if you can actually hear that, but I'm going to include all of these in the map that I keep talking about releasing. Anyhow, let's continue. Let's move on to a new world, because it's usually easier to create individual assets without having a lot of clutter around. To begin, a good practice, since we're modeling actually human-sized furniture, would be to add a reference model. And by that I mean just add CSM, like I have selected already, so that we can use him as a sort of a proportions guide to know which ends, because usually it's much harder to model without any references to what the actual human height is. Let's place it somewhere closer to the beginning, closer to the center, and add a new model file. Place it at the center and enter the SedIT mode. This time, since I want to talk about other UV mapping tools, we're going to start with a cylinder primitive, because I want to do some sort of modern looking furniture chair-like thing. I don't know. I did the model earlier, and I guess it will act as a good example to the tools I want to talk about today. For the central axis, select the X1, and this pretty much means the axis the cylinder is going to face in quotations. So the flat parts will be on the selected axis, and the round ones will be in all the other ones. And I'm going to use 16 as size. Drop it, and let's resize it to fit our player model. I know that Sam's knees are somewhere around here, and I want to make this about knee height, and stretch it out a bit. Some more to make it look more comfortable. And something like that. Now something I need to mention first, I created a second render configuration on my GNOME 5 key, and this one has the camera effects, image processing and tone mapping disabled, because if I have those on, you can see that HDR and tone mapping is trying to compensate, and that usually tends to give you weird lighting artifacts if you don't have it properly set up. So when modeling on a new world without a post-processing of entity, it's a good idea to have a new render mode saved that has those disabled. Anyhow, to continue, since I want to use the SAM model at a later time, I can simply use the visibility tab over here and temporarily hide him from my view. The entity is still there, it is just not rendered, and I can use the show hidden button to display the entity. There is a second layer of visibility. This is called the permanently hide selected entities, and I'm not really sure why it's called permanently, but you can easily use this as a second hide entity. So if I have a few more models here, and these are hidden, and CSM is permanently hidden, I can selectively show those entities. For example, if I want to show my models, I can use the show hidden, and if I want to show Sam, I can use the permanently show hidden button. So you can use these to organize your hidden entities, but this is usually just for editing. I usually don't leave entities hidden when releasing a map. I'm not really sure if it will cause any errors. It is just the way I like to do it. But while editing, there's nothing wrong with hiding your entities temporarily. Anyhow, to continue modding, the first thing I want to do is bevel the edges. to give this a more sort of nicer and smoother round look. Something like that. And usually it's a good practice to leave UV mapping for last, but since this is SedIT, some of the truths, and especially the truth I want to talk about today, will get confused if your mesh is too complex. So to make our lives easier, I'm going to UV map this now, and not later when we're going to get errors. Enter UV mode by num8, and today we're going to be using the cylindrical projection method. I have selected all of the entities except the top one most, and the bevel ones are also selected. And now I'm simply going to use the cylindrical method projected on the x-axis and use it to fit both U and V, although it's usually better to just U, but for this tutorial I'm going to use don't fit, and we're going to get this. And what the cylindrical projection method does is simply take all of the polygons and look at the axis and map them in sort of a band following the one after the other polygon until the entire band or cylinder of selected polygons is mapped according to the axis. Now this will screw up if you have a more complex cylinder, so to demonstrate this, let's add a cut here. Like so, and stretch these down. Now if I try to UV map this with the cylinder projection, it's not my day. Anyhow, if I try to UV map these, I'm going to get errors. And by errors I mean that the beveled edges, as you can see here, are actually not correctly UV mapped. Well, they're still correctly, but this is much harder to use than my previous UV map that I did before I made the mesh any more complex. So keep that in mind, that the cylindrical and a few of these other ones, especially the spherical and the more spherical and cylindrical projections, tend to work not as intended if your mesh is too complex. Now let's add some sort of a shader to have some sort of a texture to project on this. Earlier when I was making this tutorial, I found out that CSM3 doesn't really have any good fabric material, so I took some time to make my own one, as you can see, and it looks fairly decent for when I use a smaller stretch of it, like so. For those of you, if you're watching this tutorial before I release the map, you can find a fairly decent substitute for this if you go to Textures, Generic, and go to Fabric down here. And the rough dark fabric color map is a fairly decent one, although it looks like something that's been out in the rain for way too long than it should have. For now I'm going to stick with the one I made. If I can get back to it. Like so. As you can see, the size ratio between the band of polygons up here and the bottom one down here is fairly great, and I can't really fix this by myself if I just use the base stretch, because the base stretch applies a stretch to all of the polygons and textures of the current polygon map and the shader that's visible. So to actually fix this, I can go and manually stretch out the UV map on the side down here. Just stretch it out a bit and widen it a bit. And you can see this creates a nice illusion, but there is a certain problem with the cylindrical projection, and I can illustrate this better if I use a different texture, like for example this one that I made. Now by default, the way it is, the cylinder creates a texture that's exactly 1 UV unit in length, I mean the U axis, and from here to here the texture tiles exactly once. And I can see that if I use the if I display the texture, you can see that the tiling will always be the same, and there will be no seams between, no matter how much I stretch this out. But if I manually modify the size of this polygon, I will get a noticeable seaming error. Stretch it out some more, like so. You can see that the texture actually ends here and then repeats over here, and for any more complex texture this would create visible seams, as I can demonstrate if I use a more noticeable texture like these, like the bricks from the earlier map. You can see that there's a visible seam down here, and usually this won't matter. Players won't probably notice this. A good way to create a perfectly seamless map, for if you, for example, if you have a large column, it's in cylindrical and you have this detailed texture on it, and you want to create a seamless repetition of it, you can do this by creating a perfectly align your polygon islands to stretch exactly 2 times. 2 times the texture, the 2 times a single UV unit. And you can see the slightly brighter lines here. This means that the texture repeats on these coordinates. So if I want my texture to stretch down my island, it would have to have a shape similar to this, so that the texture repeats 2 times on its length and only once on its width. And to manually adjusting it like this would be harder and probably won't give you exactly perfect results. So for this we have something called the fit projection. And what this is pretty much a tool that allows you to realign your polygons on your selection in any given way. So you have the fit both UV, fit U, fit V. These are the standard ones from the other projection methods. You should probably be familiar with them. So if I use fit both U and V, it's going to realign my selection, stretch it down accordingly to fit the single UV square. And if I use fit U, it's going to stretch it so that it fits the horizontal axis, but will keep the vertical axis unchanged. So even if it is really tiny like so, fit U will keep its tininess and just reposition it so that the ends are at exactly 1 U and 0 and 1 UV coordinates. And I also have the UV, fit V, and this will stretch so that the edge ones, the horizontal ones, are stretched down to fit the 1 UV space. And I'm going into such great detail for this is because this also allows me to stretch out my selection using the stretch and also offset it. Offset by 1 or 2, you know, this is the simple offset value, and the stretching one, which allows me to stretch out my selection. Now stretching is a bit of a science, not really a science but an art, because the stretch V value doesn't actually do anything. So even if I set this to 200, it won't have any effect. Now I don't really know if this is an error or lacking functionality, but there are ways to get around this. So for example, if I want to make this to stretch it out 2 times in the U axis but only once in the V one, I can use fit both U and V, stretch U 2 times, like so, and then set the stretch value and use the fit V to stretch the edges to fit my V axis. And similarly, if I wanted to make this repeat 2 times on the V axis and only once on the U one, I can use fit both stretch, then use fit U to shrink the sides to fit the horizontal 1 UV unit on the V axis. And if I want to stretch this out more, there is something I can do and use the keep aspect ratio. But this is what usually takes me around some time to play around with this to figure out how to correctly use this. But what the keep aspect ratio does is pretty much try to maintain the relevant aspect between this side and the other one. So if I want to show, this allows me to easily stretch out my selection without having to reset it to a square every time I want to modify precisely the size of the polygon island. So I've been rambling here, and as you can see, this is pretty much an art and takes a while, takes some tweaking to get used to stretching your polygons like this. I usually do UV mapping in Blender, so this is kind of new to me. So I only played with this a bit before I started recording this tutorial. Okay, I'm just going in circles here. There we go. And anyhow, the seam is now gone. And you can edit the side polygons, stretch them out, because the circle doesn't accurately represent the oval shape on my actual mesh. And stretch it down a bit to create a relevant or equal size ratio between the band of polygons on my cylinder and the one on the side here. Let me go back to my reference texture a bit. So I can more easily adjust the ratios. And there we go. This is a pretty nice UV mapping. Now we can move on to creating a more complex mesh for this. Alright, let's go back to our fabric material and set up the shader a bit. Something like that. It looks welcoming. Well, not really. And now let's take care of that and create some sort of an indentation as if someone's been sitting in it. I'm going to use the SAM model again to figure out exactly where the human's feet would be if someone's actually sitting in this. So I positioned SAM exactly in front of it, and now let's create a indentation in the middle part, so it goes a bit indented as if someone's been sitting in it. I can do that simply by selecting all the polygons on my row and using the knife tool to create cut lines. But there is also another tool I can use, and this one's under modify, and it's called maybe it's under add. Yes, it's under add, and it's called the band saw. And what it does is take a band of polygons. For example, this is a band, you know, the cylindrical side. This one down here is also a band, and these are all bands. As you can pause the video to examine the illustration, and these are not bands. A band is pretty much a polygon. A band is pretty much a quad polygon, a sort of sequence of quad polygons that are connected with each other. Any triangles or n-gons can't define a band of polygons. So you have to make sure that your polygons are a row quads, like I have on my cylinder down here. So even if I have only two selected, the band saw will automatically select the entire band, like you just saw. Let me do this again. I just select just two polygons, and the band saw selects the entire band it detects. And the same applies on the edges here, as you can see. So use the band saw, entering top-down view, and let's create the source. You have from tools, and if you expand source, you have a container and the location from the beginning of the band. So for example, the offset is from the right side in my case, but in your case it might be from any other side. So for example, for some reason I start being able to modify this. I see. Uniform cuts means that all the cuts are exactly spaced equally. And if I turn this off, it allows me to create a random position of the cut. So let's move this like 0.8 and create another one at 0.2. And I guess I'm going to need the third one somewhere in the middle, like 0.5. And now let's drop these. And that was the balance outro. Really useful if you manage to maintain your balance in your models. It's also called a edge loop knife in Blender. Anyhow, let's select the polygons on the surface here and stretch them down a bit and then rotate to give this a more sort of indented look. Move these ones backwards, and on the middle part here, move this entire thing downwards a bit. And we can stretch this out a bit on the front one, since usually there will be legs here, so only the sides where the legs are will be bended, and the material would push out in the middle. Something similar to this. And also as a final tweak, I can move the bottommost edges, so this won't stay as a circle, but would look as if it's actually pressing down on the ground. And then move the entire mesh downwards a bit. Inviting, isn't it? Anyhow, we can continue adding a sort of more parts to this, and I will see you later on. So now I'm just going to repeat the process I did before to create a back support for the chair. Create a new cylinder, place it at the x-axis, set a value so that it will display. I'm going to use 16 again for the seat. And I'm using the player model to see what I'm doing. Stretching it down, and I might actually speed this up, since I'm pretty much doing the exact same thing as I did where I covered in this tutorial. So speeding up, and I'll see you up ahead. There we go. Now for the final and possibly most fun part, let's adjust the shader configuration for the fabric and the metal material I added for the supports. For the fabric, I also made a gloss map and a normal map. Now you know what a normal map does from the previous tutorial? As you can see, it just makes it bumpy. But the gloss map mask, this is simply a black and white image. If I can display it any better. Yeah, there we go. This is simply a black and white image that tells the shader where to apply specularity and where not to apply it. You can think of it as a sort of a alpha mask that simply masks specularity and reflections for a shader. So for the fabric, I made it so that the bumps and hues and valleys reflect, and the sides are darker. Now I can also reduce the bounce edge a bit because it's a bit too strong. Maybe something like this will do. And increase the coating color by simply clicking on the third square and dragging. And increasing the specularity. And this usually takes some tweaking to get right. Something like this. And finally we can add a stain shader to mostly increase the brightness of the chair and colorize it more easily. I can also apply colorization through the coating color and base color individually, but since I want to color both at the same time, this is just easier for me. I'm going to go for something lime green, or I don't know. Feel free to insert your color of preference here. Actually, maybe go for something more stylishly bluish. Let's see. And now I can add a backlight, again by stationing the backlight color. And what the backlight is pretty much a Frenzo effect that applies a sort of a outline lightening to the model, and you can control the angle of which it offsets, falls off. So 90 degrees is a really sharp line, and anything less is a very smooth transition. This is used for creating more realistic lighting effects for sort of velvet surfaces or velour. There we go. And for the metal material, I'm simply going to increase the base specularity, and this will make it shiny when there is a probe light around. But there's no probe light right now, so this doesn't really demonstrate how the base specularity works, but it simply takes the reflection texture and multiplies it with the base texture, unlike the coating color, which uses a add filter. For those of you familiar with image editing, you should know what those are, and for those that aren't familiar, here's an illustration of how the different filters affect a texture. Pause and continue. There's also a thing called the smoothing angle, and this means that the normal transition between two polygons can be smoothed out to create a smooth effect if the angle between the given two polygons is less than the specified here. So for the chair up here, I can demonstrate this. If I use a smoothing angle of 1, this means that there's no smoothing applied at all. And if I gradually increase this, you're going to see how the angles on the middle part, because the angle between each polygon is very small, it's under 42 degrees, is smoothed out, and the beveled ones are still pretty hard, but if I keep increasing this, they eventually get smoothed out on their own. And I can create really extreme smoothing even when the angle is up over 90 degrees. If I increase this to 120, and this gives us a smooth sort of blended look for the entire polygons. And there we go, a complete modern looking chair. Let's save it somewhere so that I won't lose it. I'm going to go for objects. Already made a folder for these. Years of experience have taught me to name everything with a 01 in the end. Anyhow, now I can simply copy paste this in our room. We can create some sort of an arrangement with them. Ta-da! We have chairs, and pretty comfy looking ones, if I was able to sit in them. Now we can continue to make a sort of a table, some decorations for it, but by now a table wouldn't be anything different than a simple these simple cylinders and a support structure. Wow, I'm really running out of space here fast, so let's keep this short. I want to show you guys a few more things before I end this tutorial, and let's try to do that before my hard drive explodes. As you can see, I made a table, simple cylinders for the metal construction. I also added the probe light from the Inventor's Cube world. I just copy pasted it here, that works too. And true, so it has the reflection. Anyhow, what I wanted to show you guys was the refraction shader, and what this does is pretty much just, well, refracts or bends light that passes through the material. It can have a normal map, also known as a bump map, and it could give you this pretty nice stained glass effect. I can control the bump strength to give a more smooth effect, or set it all the way up to 1 for a really distorted stained glass effect. But the way I want to use it for the table though is using the distortion bias. It is pretty much the angle on which light passing through it gets bended. Usually negative values are better used, like so, because you can see how the light gets sort of pushed out when passing through. I'm going to go with negative or positive. Let's see, 0.1 or something like that, and it creates a pretty nice sort of effect on the glass surface of the table. You can go really far away with this, all the way up to 1, which is a really high distortion, but this tends to give you errors. And you can really go to a really high negative value, but this will also give you errors. You can actually simulate convex and other shapes of lenses using the distortion bias. If you have a spherical or convex or any other sort of lens, it will behave in a similar fashion. Anyhow, I'm digressing. Let's set it to positive 0.1. And for the edges, I'm going to select the edge polygons of my glass plane and assign them to a new map, and I'm going to call this class NB, and simply copy paste the glass material I made for the surface. And I'm doing this to give a more realistic edge feel with a stain shader, coloring the reflection green, because you know how glass tends to tend towards the green values when self-reflecting itself, as you can see, and it creates a pretty nice and realistic effect. I can also add a stains effect to the top surface and give it some sort of a texture. Let's see. Then to create some sort of a distorted or cluttered surface of the table, but this will come at a later time. Anyhow, this is what I wanted to mention about the stain shader. By now you should probably know how to create your own furniture and continue modding this map. In later tutorials I'm going to show you how to do other objects such as a cup or a sort of a plate using the rotation and lathe tools. But for now you can do simple stuff like add more furniture decoration to the walls, make some sort of a desk, other chairs, and give more detail to the map. I would like to see screenshots this time, to see what you guys did with how you guys managed to decipher my ramblings, because yeah, I know I digressed a lot in the tutorial, and everything I failed to explain in the video I will explain in greater detail in the description below. So if you have any questions, you should check that out first, and then you can always find me on Steam or YouTube to ask me your question. Anyhow, this is Mischievous, I'm running out of space, this is SedIT, and happy modeling of furniture. By the way, you're no longer a beginner, you're now an intermediate, so prepare for diversity in the future.